The phone call came in the middle of the morning. Michelle Carter had just finished her last court session of the day. As the gavel hit the surface of her desk with the final bang, signaling the end of the case, she leaned back in her chair, rubbing her eyes. It had been a long week filled with complex cases, a series of difficult decisions, and little time for herself. She had become accustomed to the pressure, the responsibility, and the constant grind of the judicial system. But today, something felt different. It wasn't the usual exhaustion, it was an unease that crept in when you knew something unexpected was coming, but you couldn't put your finger on exactly what it was. Her office was dimly lit, the shadows of the towering law books on the shelves stretching across the walls. The air smelled faintly of coffee and old leather. The city outside was busy, bustling, yet here in her small corner of the world, Michelle often found peace in the quiet moments after court had ended. It was a time to reflect on the cases she had worked on, to organize her thoughts, to prepare for the next day. But today, that peace was shattered by the sudden ring of her phone. Her assistant had already left for the day, and the office was mostly empty, so the sound of the ringing phone felt unusually loud in the stillness. She hesitated for a moment, wondering if she should let it go to voicemail, but something urged her to pick it up. Perhaps it was a call from her mentor, Judge Thomas, or an urgent matter that needed her immediate attention. Either way, she wasn't expecting what would come next. "Hello." Michelle answered, her voice steady, though a knot began to form in her stomach. The voice on the other end was cold, formal, and without any hint of warmth or empathy. The kind of voice that immediately sent a chill down your spine. "Judge Carter, this is the office of the Judicial Oversight Committee. We are notifying you that, effective immediately, you are being dismissed from your position as a federal judge." Michelle's mind went blank. Dismissed? Her hand tightened around the phone, and for a moment, she wasn't sure if she had heard the words correctly. "Excuse me." "What?" Michelle replied, her voice shaky despite her attempt to maintain composure. There was no hesitation from the other side. The person continued, speaking in an emotionless tone, "Your actions involving Mr. Elon Musk have resulted in this decision. We are not at liberty to discuss the details at this time. You are relieved of all duties, effective immediately. Please pack your belongings and vacate the premises." The line went dead. Michelle stood frozen, her body numb. The phone slipped from her grip and fell onto the desk with a quiet thud. She stared at it for several long seconds, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Her mind raced, trying to process the words. Fired. For helping Elon Musk? She had only been trying to do what she thought was right. She had no idea how it had all gone wrong so quickly. She had always been known for her integrity. Judge Michelle Carter was one of the most respected figures in the judicial system, a woman who had worked her entire life to earn her seat at the bench. Her career had been built on fairness, honesty, and the pursuit of justice. She had never let her personal beliefs cloud her judgment, and she had never backed down from a tough decision, no matter how hard it was. But now, all of that was gone. In a matter of seconds, the phone call had shattered everything. All her hard work, her sacrifices, her years of service, it all seemed meaningless now. She glanced around her office, trying to make sense of the chaos inside her mind. Her walls, once lined with certificates and honors, now felt like a cruel reminder of everything she had lost. The faint hum of the city outside seemed distant, almost mocking. The weight of her dismissal was heavy, pressing down on her chest. Michelle had always been the one in control. She had prided herself on making tough decisions, on following the letter of the law. But today, for the first time in her career, she felt powerless. She had no idea who was behind this, or why they had chosen her. She had helped Elon Musk, yes, that was true. But how could that decision, one that she had thought was in line with justice and the greater good, lead to this? Her mind flashed back to the events that had brought her to this point. She had met Elon several years ago, when he had requested her expertise on a complex legal matter involving one of his companies. Initially, she had been hesitant. Musk was a polarizing figure, and his actions often raised eyebrows. But as they worked together, she had come to respect his vision, his drive, and his ability to challenge the status quo. In many ways, he reminded her of herself. A person who had fought tooth and nail to be where she was. She had seen the humanity behind the billionaire persona, the person who genuinely wanted to change the world. And that, she had believed, was worth supporting. But now, as she sat there in her office, staring at the empty space around her, it was hard to reconcile that belief with the reality of her situation. Her actions had made her a target. The very people she had trusted, her colleagues, her superiors, had turned on her. Why? Was it because of the power that Elon Musk held, or was there something else at play? Michelle had always trusted the system. She had worked within it for years, believing that it would uphold fairness and integrity. But now she saw the cracks in the foundation. She had been a pawn in a much larger game, a game that she hadn't fully understood until it was too late. And now, she was the one who had been sacrificed. Her hands trembled as she picked up the phone again, dialing the number for her lawyer. But the call went straight to voicemail. She tried to call other contacts, Judge Thomas, her mentor, but no one was picking up. She was alone. In the silence of her office, Michelle realized just how isolated she truly was. What now? What was left for her in this new reality? The world outside her office seemed unchanged, as though nothing had happened, but inside, everything had shifted. Her future had become uncertain, her reputation tarnished. What would you do if one decision cost you everything? The words echoed in her mind, a haunting reminder of how quickly life could change. Suddenly, the phone rang again. Michelle's heart skipped a beat, and she picked up the receiver with trembling fingers. This time, the voice on the other end was different. This time, it wasn't someone from the Judicial Oversight Committee. It was a familiar voice, a voice she had never expected to hear in this moment. Elon Musk. Michelle's heart sank, her breath catching in her throat. What could he possibly say now? Michelle, I never meant for any of this to happen, Elon said, his voice low and regretful. You've been caught in something much bigger than you realize. I'll do everything I can to help you, but you need to understand, this is just the beginning. What would you do if your life took an unexpected turn, and the people you thought you could trust weren't who they seemed? Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Michelle Carter had never imagined her life would lead her to this point. Growing up in a modest neighborhood in Philadelphia, she had always been driven, always determined to rise above the expectations others had for her. The youngest of 3 children, Michelle was raised by a single mother who worked multiple jobs to provide for her family. Her mother, Gloria, was a woman of immense strength, but also one who carried a quiet sadness. Michelle often saw her mother late at night, poring over bills with a furrowed brow, or cleaning late into the evening to make ends meet. From a young age, Michelle knew she wanted to escape the cycle of poverty. She wanted more, not just for herself, but for her family. She remembered the long hours of studying, the nights where she stayed up late reading casebooks and textbooks, her mother always encouraging her, even when she couldn't fully understand her daughter's ambition. One day, you'll wear that black robe, Michelle, her mother would say, her voice filled with both pride and longing. I know it. Michelle had no idea at the time how prophetic those words would be. She worked tirelessly through high school and college, always focused on her end goal. While many of her peers sought comfort and relaxation, Michelle studied law and spent her summers interning at local law offices, learning the ins and outs of the legal world. When Michelle was accepted into law school at Yale, it felt like the culmination of a dream. She had sacrificed so much, lost friendships, spent countless nights alone in her dorm room, all for this moment. But when she walked across the stage to receive her diploma, she knew that it wasn't just her victory. It was her mother's victory too. After graduation, Michelle's rise in the legal world was rapid. She became a law clerk, then quickly made her way up the ranks, eventually landing a position as a federal judge. It was a job she had worked her entire life to get, a job that demanded respect and unwavering commitment. She had finally achieved what she had dreamed of, and it felt like all the years of hard work were paying off. But the higher she climbed, the more she saw the compromises. The behind-the-scenes deals. The power struggles. Michelle had never been naive. She understood that the legal system was far from perfect, but the constant pressure to maintain appearances, to play politics, weighed on her. Then came the case that changed everything. The case that brought her face to face with Elon Musk. Michelle had always admired the visionary, the entrepreneur who seemed to have a hand in everything from electric cars to space exploration. There was something magnetic about him. His drive, his ambition, his refusal to accept the status quo, it resonated with Michelle in ways she hadn't expected. She saw in him the same ambition that had driven her as a young girl. But she also saw the pressure he was under, the world constantly watching and criticizing every move he made. She saw the humanity behind the billionaire persona, something that many missed. Their first meeting was casual, a simple request for her legal expertise. Elon had a high-profile legal issue that required the delicate handling of the judicial system, and he sought her advice. At first, Michelle had been cautious. She knew that associating with someone as powerful and controversial as Musk could have consequences. But her professional curiosity, paired with her belief in fairness, led her to agree to take the case. It didn't take long for Michelle to see that her decision to help him was more than just a professional one. She found herself admiring his passion for innovation, his drive to make the world a better place. It was easy to see why people followed him, why they believed in his vision. He was a force of nature. But the case was never simple. There were complications, legal maneuvers, powerful opposition, and whispers in the corridors of power. The pressure from higher-ups within the system to drop the case or rule against Musk was immense. But Michelle, always determined to do what she believed was right, refused to back down. She followed the law, and that was what mattered. In the years that followed, Michelle became more involved in Musk's legal affairs, providing him with advice and assistance on various matters. They maintained a professional relationship, but there was an understanding between them, a mutual respect. Yet, as her ties to Musk grew, so did the scrutiny. The higher-ups began to take notice of her increasing involvement with the billionaire, and soon, the whispers turned into public outcry. People began to question her objectivity. There were rumors, whispers that perhaps Michelle was more than just a legal advisor to Elon Musk. They said she was too close to him, that her judgment had been compromised. The media had a field day with it. But Michelle stood her ground. She had always believed in her integrity. She had always been certain that her decisions were based on the law, not on personal relationships. But the public didn't see it that way. The pressure grew, and she felt it creeping into her professional life. Then, the storm broke. One of Michelle's rulings in Musk's favor had raised more than a few eyebrows. It wasn't the first time, but this case had been the tipping point. The backlash was immediate. News outlets speculated about her closeness to Musk. Political figures weighed in, some accusing her of being biased, others suggesting that she was being used by him for his own gain. It was during this time that Michelle began to feel the weight of her choices. She had always prided herself on her ability to stand firm, but now, for the first time, she questioned whether her efforts to help Musk had cost her too much. She had no idea just how high the stakes would become, nor how much more she would lose before this was over. The phone call earlier that day, the one that dismissed her from the bench, was the culmination of everything that had been building for months. It was a decision she never saw coming, a betrayal that hit harder than anything she had ever faced. For the first time in her career, she felt small, powerless, and utterly alone. As she sat in her office, trying to process the flood of emotions coursing through her, Michelle's thoughts drifted back to the pivotal moment in her career. The moment she had made the choice to help Elon Musk, believing she was doing the right thing. She had followed the law, trusted in her judgment, and believed in fairness. But had she made a mistake? Had the price of helping Musk been too high? As the evening sun began to set, casting long shadows across her office, Michelle found herself facing the harsh truth: her life was about to change in ways she couldn't even begin to imagine. And it wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about everything she had built, everything she had worked for, and everything she had lost. The story was far from over. The storm had just begun to gather. Michelle sat in the dimly lit office, staring at the clutter of papers before her. The phone call earlier that day had shattered her world, but what followed was even more unsettling. She knew something wasn't right. The dismissal, the coldness in the voice on the other end of the line, none of it made sense. As she tried to gather her thoughts, a single question kept swirling in her mind: why? The weight of the situation pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She had spent the entire evening pacing the floor, too restless to sit still. The phone rang again. This time, she didn't even wait for the first ring to finish. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up, hoping, praying, that it was someone who could shed light on the events of the day. "Hello?" Michelle said, trying to mask the unease in her voice. "Michelle, it's Thomas. I just heard. I'm so sorry." Judge Thomas Harris had been Michelle's mentor for over a decade. A stern but fair figure, he had taught her the nuances of the law and guided her through the toughest cases. He was one of the few people she could trust in this world that had suddenly turned cold and hostile. "What happened?" Michelle asked, her voice almost a whisper. "Why would they do this to me? I didn't." "I know. I know," Judge Thomas interrupted, his voice softening. "But Michelle, this goes beyond the Musk case. They've been watching you for a while. The decision to let Musk into your orbit, it made some powerful people uncomfortable. And now you're caught in something much bigger than you realize." Michelle's heart raced, her mind struggling to grasp his words. "What do you mean? I don't understand." "I followed the law. I did what I thought was right." "I know you did. But sometimes, in our line of work, doing what's right isn't enough," Thomas said, his tone laced with regret. "You've become a target, Michelle. A pawn in a larger game. The question is, who's pulling the strings?" Michelle's mind spun. A pawn? A game? Her career, her life, her reputation, everything she had worked so hard to build, had been reduced to a piece on a chessboard, moved at the whim of some unseen force. She had been trying to do the right thing, but in the end, it had all come crashing down. The silence on the other end of the line was thick with the weight of the truth they both knew but hadn't wanted to face. "I need to know who's behind this," Michelle said, her voice steady, but the determination in it was undeniable. "Who is trying to ruin me?" "I don't have all the answers yet," Judge Thomas replied, his voice heavy with caution. "But I'm looking into it. We have to be careful. Whoever's behind this has connections everywhere, connections that even I don't fully understand. And they're not done with you yet." Michelle's grip on the phone tightened. "Then what do I do now? Do I just sit here and wait for them to finish the job?" "No," Thomas replied sharply. "You fight back. But you need to be smart about it. You need to find out who's pulling the strings. You need to get ahead of this." The line went silent for a moment as Michelle let the weight of his words sink in. Fight back. It felt like the only option she had left. But how? Where would she even start? Who could she trust? It was as if the ground had been ripped out from under her, and she was falling, unable to see where she would land. "I don't know if I can do this alone," Michelle admitted, her voice cracking. "I've lost everything, Thomas. My career, my reputation, and now, I'm left wondering who in the world is behind this. I don't even know where to start. I'll help you, Thomas said firmly. But you have to be careful. You're not just up against a group of politicians or judges. Whoever's behind this has resources, power, people who will stop at nothing to make sure you're out of the picture. But if anyone can fight back, it's you, Michelle. You've been through worse. Michelle's mind flashed to the many battles she had fought over the years, both in and out of the courtroom. She had stood up against corruption, injustice, and even her own doubts. She had faced long nights, difficult decisions, and impossible odds. But she had never been up against something like this. "Thank you," Michelle said, her voice steadying, her resolve beginning to form. "I'll need to think this through. I'll need to be strategic." "I know you will," Thomas replied. "And don't forget, there are people who still believe in you. Don't let them take that away from you." The conversation ended, but the storm inside Michelle's mind continued to rage. What had started as a simple case had spiraled into something much larger. Someone was out to destroy her, and she needed answers. But where would she find them? Who could she trust? The people who had once supported her, the colleagues, the friends, had all vanished, leaving her standing alone in a world that no longer made sense. Suddenly, the phone rang again. This time, Michelle didn't hesitate. She grabbed the receiver, her breath catching in her throat. She didn't know if this was a sign of hope or just another part of the trap closing in around her. "Michelle, it's Elon," came the familiar voice on the other end. "I know this has been hard for you. But trust me, this isn't over. They're coming for you, and I want to help. You're not in this alone." Michelle felt her pulse quicken. Elon. Despite everything that had happened, despite the way things had spiraled out of control, his voice still brought a sense of relief. But could she trust him? After everything? She had to make a choice, and quickly. "What do you want from me, Elon?" Michelle's voice was sharp, no longer soft and uncertain. "I want you to listen," he said. "I have resources. I have connections. But I need you to trust me. You're not the only one being targeted here. There are bigger forces at play, and you need to be ready for whatever comes next." Michelle's mind raced as she processed his words. Bigger forces at play. She had no idea what that meant, but she knew one thing for sure: things were far from over. The tension in the air was palpable. The storm was coming, and Michelle Carter had no choice but to face it head-on. She would have to dig deep, deeper than she had ever gone before, if she was going to uncover the truth and fight back. The road ahead was unclear, but Michelle knew one thing: she was ready to fight. The phone call with Elon left Michelle shaken, but there was something about the way he spoke that stirred a flicker of hope in her chest. He hadn't asked for anything in return, not yet. Instead, he offered his resources, his connections, and a glimmer of a plan. The reality of what she had just heard settled in her mind, but now, with her life upended and her career in shambles, Michelle had no choice but to act. The very idea that she might be facing an orchestrated attack, one far beyond just her professional mishandling of a single case, was terrifying. But, despite her fear, Michelle couldn't shake the nagging thought that this was more than just about her. There were deeper forces at play. And those forces had already begun to close in on her. She stood in her office, staring at the empty chair across from her desk. It felt strange, the office that had once been filled with activity now eerily quiet. She had always been surrounded by people, law clerks, assistants, interns, faces that were now absent from her life. Gone, just like that. But I'm not gone, she thought. I'm still standing. And I'll fight. It had been 3 days since the call. The first 2 had been a blur. She had withdrawn from her usual routine, too paralyzed by shock and disbelief to take any significant action. But now, she had no choice. If she was going to survive, she needed to be smarter, more strategic. She needed answers, and fast. Michelle knew she had to reach out to her few remaining allies. The legal world was a close-knit community, and while she had been burned by most of her colleagues, there were still a few who could be trusted. But the challenge was knowing who to trust. Elon Musk had offered help, and while his words had been genuine, she wasn't entirely sure she could rely on him. There were far too many moving pieces, and she needed to be sure of who was with her, and who might be playing a deeper game. With that thought in mind, Michelle decided to visit her mentor, Judge Thomas Harris. He had offered guidance before, and now, more than ever, she needed his insight. Her next move had to be calculated. She had no more room for mistakes. If she was going to fight back, she couldn't afford to be impulsive. Michelle arrived at Thomas's office that afternoon, her mind racing. The building was one of the older structures in the city, its long, polished floors and towering bookshelves filled with decades of legal history. As she walked past the rows of law texts, she couldn't help but reflect on how much her life had revolved around the law. The very law that was now being twisted against her. She knocked gently on the door before entering. Thomas was sitting behind his massive mahogany desk, sorting through papers. He looked up, a solemn look on his face. "Michelle," he said with a deep sigh, setting aside the stack of legal briefs. "I didn't expect to see you today." Michelle took a seat in front of his desk, her hands clasped tightly together. She could see the concern in his eyes. Thomas had always been a man of action, steady and reliable. But now, it seemed like even he was uncertain about what lay ahead. "I don't know where to start, Thomas," Michelle admitted, her voice shaky. "This whole thing is spinning out of control. I thought I knew how to handle it, but I'm not sure anymore." Thomas leaned forward, his brows furrowed in thought. "It's a dangerous game, Michelle. You've been drawn into something much bigger than just a legal case. This is about power, people who don't care about the law, only about maintaining control. But you're not alone in this. There are forces out there that will try to crush you, yes, but you also have people on your side." "People on my side?" Michelle repeated, half doubtful. "Who?" "You're not the first to face something like this," Thomas said, his voice a bit more grave than usual. "There's a network of people who've been through what you're going through. They understand the stakes, and they know how to navigate the kind of system you're up against. It's not just about you anymore. It's about a group of people who have been wronged. They're the ones you need to turn to." Michelle's curiosity piqued. "Who are they?" "I can't tell you everything just yet. But I'll put you in touch with someone. They'll guide you, Michelle. You have to be ready to take this fight to places you've never been before. It's not just about the law anymore. It's about survival." Michelle absorbed his words, her thoughts racing. Survival. That's what this had come to. She had to outsmart those who had already planned her downfall. But if she was going to navigate this treacherous path, she needed allies, real, trusted allies. "I'll do whatever it takes," Michelle said, her tone steady now. "I can't just sit here and wait. If I'm going down fighting." Thomas gave her a grim nod. "I admire your resolve. But you have to remember, this isn't a simple legal battle. There are people in high places who will stop at nothing to protect their interests. They don't play by the same rules you do. So, you'll need to learn to play by their rules, or at least, learn how to beat them at their own game." Michelle nodded, her jaw clenched. She had come this far by following the rules. But it was clear now that the rules had changed, and she needed to adapt. She had to enter a world that was more dangerous, more complex, than she had ever imagined. Thomas stood up and moved toward the bookshelf, pulling a small, nondescript envelope from one of the lower drawers. He handed it to Michelle without saying a word. "This will get you started," he said, his voice low. "But be careful. The people you're about to meet won't hesitate to use you if it suits them. Trust no one completely. Michelle took the envelope, feeling the weight of it in her hands. Inside, she knew, would be the first step on a journey into a world that would test everything she believed in. She didn't hesitate. As she walked out of the office, the cool air hit her face, and for the first time in days, she felt a sense of clarity. She had no idea what awaited her, but she was ready. The stakes were higher than ever, but Michelle wasn't the same person who had walked into that courtroom months ago. She was no longer just a judge. She was someone who had lost everything, and now, she had everything to fight for. The journey was just beginning. Michelle sat alone in her apartment, the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. It had been 2 days since her meeting with Judge Thomas, and while the envelope he'd given her had provided the first clue to understanding the forces pulling the strings, it hadn't brought her any closer to the truth. The information inside was minimal, just a phone number and a name. But it was enough to push her into the next stage of the fight. Now, she had no choice but to make the call. She stared at the number on the crumpled piece of paper, her heart pounding in her chest. The weight of what was happening felt suffocating. She had once been a respected judge, known for her calm demeanor, her rational decisions, and her unwavering commitment to justice. But now, she was on the verge of losing it all. Her career, her reputation, everything she had worked for was slipping through her fingers. Just make the call, she told herself, reaching for the phone. Her fingers hesitated just above the dial pad. The moment felt unreal, as if the reality of what she was about to do hadn't fully sunk in. She took a deep breath and pressed the number. The phone rang 3 times before a voice answered on the other end. Hello. The voice was sharp, authoritative, but with an edge of something more, a quiet tension that made Michelle's skin crawl. This is Michelle Carter, she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. I'm looking for information. About what's happening to me. There was a long pause on the other end. Michelle could almost hear the person on the other side assessing her, weighing the decision whether or not to proceed. Go on, the voice finally said. I've been fired. Stripped of my position as a judge. Someone is behind this, and I need to know why, Michelle continued. Someone said you could help me. That you might know who's trying to ruin me. Someone, huh? The voice was almost amused. Look, you're already in deep, Michelle. You're in a game you don't understand yet. It's not just about you. It's about bigger things, about power. Michelle's breath caught. Bigger things. That phrase echoed in her mind, just as it had when Thomas said it. The people who had targeted her weren't just after her career, they were after something far more dangerous. I don't care about power, Michelle said, forcing herself to sound confident. I care about clearing my name. I want to know who's responsible. Another pause. And then, the voice responded, softer this time. If you really want to know, you have to come meet me. You're not going to get anywhere sitting at home waiting for things to fix themselves. Trust me, Michelle, this is bigger than you. But if you want to step into the fire, I'll tell you everything. Michelle's heart raced. Step into the fire. That was what she had been doing for the past few days, walking closer to the edge of a cliff, not knowing if there was anything solid left to stand on. But if she was going to fight back, she needed to know what she was up against. And the only way to do that was to trust this person. Where do I meet you? She asked, her voice resolute despite the uncertainty gnawing at her. A laugh, low and almost cynical, came through the phone. That's the spirit. I'll send you the details. Be ready. It's not going to be easy from here on out. The line went dead. Michelle stared at the phone, her hand still gripping it tightly. She had just made a decision, a dangerous one, but there was no turning back now. Her mind flashed back to everything she had lost in the last week. Her position as a judge, her reputation, her sense of security. The pieces of her life that had once seemed stable were now shattered, scattered in every direction. The world had changed, and so had she. It was in this moment, this brief silence, that the weight of what was happening hit her with full force. The man she had once admired, the people she had trusted, the system she had sworn to uphold, everything had betrayed her. Everything she believed in was being turned upside down. And now, she had to fight to keep her sanity, her sense of self, intact. She thought of her family, her mother, who had supported her through every trial, every hardship. Would she understand why Michelle was walking down this dark path? She hadn't been able to talk to her in days. She hadn't wanted to. But now, she realized that every step she took from here on out would pull her further away from her old life. She was already too deep. Too far gone. Michelle walked over to the window and looked out, the city lights twinkling below her. It felt like another lifetime since she had stood here, looking at the world with a sense of optimism, a belief that no matter what happened, she could face it. Now, the city felt cold, distant, as though it no longer belonged to her. But then she remembered Thomas's words. "You're not alone in this." She wasn't the only one who had been targeted. She wasn't the only one facing an enemy she couldn't see. And maybe, just maybe, there was still a way out of this, a way to turn the tables. With new resolve, Michelle grabbed her coat, slipped her phone into her pocket, and headed for the door. She didn't know where this journey would take her, but she was no longer afraid. The truth was out there, and she was going to find it. Whoever was behind this would have to face her. As Michelle stepped out into the night, she could feel it, things were about to get a lot more complicated. But she was ready. Ready for whatever came next. The next morning, Michelle stood in front of her apartment building, a faint chill in the air biting through her coat. The street was still dark, the early light casting long shadows. Despite the cold, she felt a strange heat rising in her chest. The weight of everything she was walking into pressed on her with a force she could not shake. Her heart pounded as she clutched her phone, watching the blinking notification for the address. The message had come through just an hour ago, the details as cryptic as she expected. But the message was clear: come alone. You won't be safe if you bring anyone with you. No one can know about this meeting. The final sentence sent a chill through her, sending the clear message that, for whatever reason, the people she was about to meet didn't want anyone to know they existed, no traces, no leads, no evidence. Taking a deep breath, Michelle stepped into her car, her mind racing. It was a risk. She had been down this road before, trusting strangers, making deals, always believing there was a way to stay on top of everything. But this time, it was different. There were forces far greater than she had imagined behind the curtain, and she wasn't just fighting to clear her name anymore. She was fighting for her life. For the survival of everything she had worked for. The drive felt endless, each mile of asphalt stretching out before her as though the world was moving in slow motion. She tried to steady her breath, trying to maintain control of her emotions. Stay calm. Stay focused. But it was getting harder to do so as the minutes ticked away. The more she thought about it, the more she felt the isolation closing in. It wasn't just that she was going to meet someone who might have answers, it was that she was crossing into a world where she no longer knew who to trust. As the car made a turn down a narrow alley, Michelle's eyes caught a glimpse of a rundown building in the distance, one that looked like it had been abandoned for years. She could see the faint light coming from the single window on the top floor. It was the only sign of life in the area. This was it. Michelle parked her car on the street and got out, her steps echoing against the empty pavement. The air seemed to grow colder as she approached the building, her every movement shadowed by the weight of what was about to happen. She didn't know who or what was waiting for her inside, but the knot in her stomach told her it wasn't going to be easy. She entered through the creaking front door, the sound of her footsteps muffled by the thick dust that had accumulated over years of abandonment. The hall was dimly lit, and the flickering lights only added to the eerie atmosphere. As Michelle walked down the hallway, a door at the far end opened. A figure emerged from the shadows. "Michelle," the figure said, his voice low and smooth. "You made it." The man was tall, wearing a long black coat, his face obscured by the low brim of a fedora. He stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. Michelle hesitated, but only for a moment. If she was going to do this, she had to be brave. Inside the room, the air was thick with cigarette smoke, the low hum of machinery buzzing in the background. A single desk lamp illuminated a cluttered desk, where papers and folders were scattered about, as if someone had been working tirelessly for hours. The room itself had an aura of secrecy, of plans being made, of information being shared in hushed tones. Michelle took a deep breath before sitting down at the small table in front of her. Her eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail. The walls were covered with maps, photographs, and documents. Everything seemed interconnected, like a giant puzzle where the pieces were still in motion. The man seated across from her didn't waste any time. He didn't need to introduce himself, she already knew who he was. Everyone in the legal world did. He was part of the underground network of people who had seen the darker side of the law. He was someone who knew how to operate in the shadows, pulling strings where others couldn't even see them. And now, he was offering her a seat at the table. "I'm sure you've been wondering who's behind all of this," he said, his voice calm, but with an unmistakable edge of authority. "The people who've been pulling the strings, trying to destroy you. It's not just about you, Michelle. It never was." Michelle nodded, her throat dry. "Who are they? Why me?" The man paused, his eyes narrowing as though he were considering how much to reveal. "You've been caught in the crossfire. But they're not just after your career, they're after the system itself. The system you've been a part of. And you're not the first one to be targeted. The things you've done, the things you've seen, they make you a threat to them. You represent a level of integrity they cannot control." Michelle's mind raced. A threat to the system? The system that she had spent her life fighting for, that had given her power and purpose, was that what had turned against her? Was it a game of control, not just a personal vendetta? "They knew that if they could take you down, they could send a message," the man continued. "You're a symbol. And they want to make sure you never make it out of this alive." A cold chill ran down Michelle's spine as his words settled in. She had never imagined this could go so deep. Her mind flashed to the countless cases she had overseen, the decisions she had made that affected powerful people. Had she unknowingly crossed a line? Had her pursuit of justice somehow made her an enemy of those who controlled everything? She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "They think they can destroy me," she thought. "They think they can take me down." But Michelle wasn't ready to give up. Not now. Not when she was so close to understanding the true depth of the conspiracy against her. "What do I need to do?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. The man smiled darkly, leaning in closer. "Now, you're playing the game." Michelle felt the weight of the choices ahead of her, each one leading deeper into a world of lies and corruption. But no matter what came next, she was ready. The fire inside her had been lit. The door clicked shut behind her as Michelle stepped into the cold, dimly lit alley, the shadows of the night enveloping her. Her breath hung in the air, a faint mist that contrasted sharply with the intensity of the conversation she had just walked away from. The man in the room had said enough to make her stomach churn and her mind race. "They're after the system. You're just a piece of it." Her heart was still pounding from the revelation. The power structures she had believed in, the legal system she had devoted her entire life to, everything was collapsing around her. The weight of the truth was almost too much to bear. She had always seen herself as a defender of justice, someone who upheld the law no matter the cost. But now, she was caught in a web of corruption and deceit that went far beyond anything she could have imagined. The man, whose name she still didn't know, had given her a choice, to keep digging and risk everything, or to walk away and let the storm pass. The temptation to turn back was strong. Her career was already on the line, her reputation tarnished beyond repair. She could easily disappear from this mess, slip back into the shadows of a quiet, uneventful life. But something deep inside her refused to let it go. She wasn't going to run. She wasn't going to back down. She would find out the truth, no matter the cost. She pulled her coat tighter around her body and began walking down the alley, her footsteps echoing against the walls. She was aware of every corner, every shadow, and the unsettling feeling that someone was watching her. It was an instinct she had developed over the years, always alert, always aware. It had kept her safe as a judge, as someone who dealt with dangerous people. But tonight, it felt different. She didn't know if she could trust anyone anymore. Michelle's phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her from her thoughts. It was a message from the unknown number, the man who had set the meeting in the first place. "Meet me in 2 hours. Don't be late." The message was brief, almost clinical, and yet it filled her with dread. She had no idea what he wanted from her now. But she didn't have much of a choice. If she wanted answers, she had to follow the breadcrumbs. As she walked back to her car, her mind churned with questions. Who were these people? And what did they really want from her? The car ride felt like an eternity. Michelle tried to calm her nerves, focusing on the road ahead. The city lights reflected off her windshield, blurring together into streaks of yellow and white. But she couldn't shake the image of the man from the building, his cryptic warnings, and the sudden realization that this whole thing was much bigger than she could have imagined. She pulled up to a small, inconspicuous building in a less populated area of the city. It was old, its windows grimy and covered in dust. The kind of place that screamed secret meeting spot. She parked the car and took a deep breath. This was it. As she stepped out of the car, she scanned the area around her, her senses heightened. The streets were quiet, too quiet. There was a heaviness in the air, as if something terrible was about to happen. Her instincts told her she was walking into a trap. But there was no turning back now. She entered the building, her heels clicking against the cold concrete floor. Inside, it was even darker, the only light coming from a single lamp in the corner. And there, sitting at a table in the center of the room, was the man. His face was partially obscured by shadows, but his presence was undeniable. The same cold authority she had felt before. "Glad you could make it," he said, his voice smooth, almost too calm. "Have a seat." Michelle didn't sit down right away. She stood there for a moment, eyeing him warily. Something about the way he spoke didn't sit right with her. It was as if he already knew the answers she was searching for, and maybe more. "What is it you want from me?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady despite the anxiety building in her chest. The man didn't respond immediately. He just looked at her, his eyes cold and calculating. "What do I want?" "I want to offer you a deal, Michelle. One that will keep you safe, and ensure that the truth doesn't destroy you." Her heart skipped a beat. A deal? The last thing she wanted to do was make deals with people she couldn't trust. But she had no other choice. "Go on," she said, her voice tight. "You've already lost everything," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "Your career, your reputation. Your life as you knew it is over. But you don't have to lose everything else. You can walk away from this, from the mess you're in. All you have to do is accept that the truth you're searching for isn't worth the cost of your life." Michelle felt a cold sweat break out on her skin. The message was clear: they could destroy her. They could silence her forever. She knew what this was, the offer of safety in exchange for silence. But she couldn't accept that. She couldn't just walk away. "What do you mean, the truth isn't worth it?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, though she fought to control it. "Who's behind all of this? What do they want?" The man leaned back in his chair, the shadows swallowing his face. They want control. They want to reshape the system, and you're just a pawn in their game. You might not realize it yet, but you're part of a much larger plan. You're too valuable to them for it to end this way. Michelle's chest tightened. And what's the plan? That's for them to know. Not you. Her eyes narrowed. I won't walk away. I'll expose them. I'll take them down. The man's lips curled into a sinister smile. Then you're as stubborn as I've heard. A chill ran down Michelle's spine as she realized that this was no longer just about her career. It was about power, corruption, and a system so far beyond her comprehension that it could destroy her without a second thought. She had stepped into the fire. Michelle stood tall, her resolve hardening. She wasn't going to back down. Not now. The fight had just begun, and no matter the cost, she was ready to face whatever came next. Michelle stepped back into the cold night air, her heart heavy, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. The conversation she had just endured still echoed in her ears, his words like a haunting melody, promising her safety but at the cost of everything she had ever stood for. Control, corruption, power, those words haunted her, like the clinging scent of smoke after a fire. The street lights flickered as she walked slowly back to her car. The weight of what was at stake crushed down on her chest, squeezing the air out of her lungs. How did things get this far? She leaned against her car for a moment, closing her eyes, trying to regain her bearings. Her thoughts swirled as she replayed the conversation. The man's cold, calculated manner had not only offered her an escape from this madness but also a bitter pill to swallow. There were people out there who wanted to control the system, and they were willing to destroy anyone who stood in their way. And here she was, a judge, an enforcer of the very laws that had shaped her life, being offered a deal to walk away. To simply disappear from the equation. But Michelle wasn't the kind of person who walked away. Not from a fight. Not from the truth. She took a deep breath, the icy night air biting at her skin, and pushed herself off the car, making her way back inside. It was time to make a choice that would shape the rest of her life. The next few days felt like an unrelenting storm. Michelle found herself entangled in a series of meetings, phone calls, and cryptic messages. It was as though the world was closing in around her, each new revelation leading to darker and deeper corners of a system she had once believed in so fiercely. The more she uncovered, the more she realized just how deeply she was embedded in a conspiracy that spanned far beyond her comprehension. Every morning, she woke up with a sense of dread gnawing at her stomach. The media had turned on her, and the public opinion was already beginning to sour. She was a figurehead in a larger narrative now, a cautionary tale of how even the most trusted figures could fall prey to forces much greater than themselves. But Michelle couldn't give in. She couldn't let them win. One morning, as she sat in her apartment, staring at the pile of case files that had once felt like a source of power, she received a message that would change everything. It was short, to the point, "We know what you're doing. If you don't stop, there will be consequences." The note wasn't signed, but Michelle didn't need to know who sent it. She had already figured out that the people behind this weren't the type to shy away from threats. They weren't afraid to pull strings and manipulate situations until they got what they wanted. She slammed the phone down on the table and stared at the stack of documents in front of her. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on her chest. For the first time since this nightmare began, Michelle questioned everything. Could she really expose this network? Could she dismantle a system that had grown so powerful, so all-encompassing, that it seemed to be operating in a world of its own? The idea of standing up to this monster felt impossible. But she couldn't walk away. Not now. It was then that Michelle realized something fundamental. The truth was never easy, and it never came without consequences. She had spent her life in pursuit of justice, and if that meant putting everything on the line, then so be it. Her phone buzzed again. Another message. But this time, the words struck a chord within her. You're not alone. It wasn't a threat. It was a lifeline. Someone out there knew what she was up against. They weren't backing down either. That night, Michelle met with the mysterious contact who had been sending her the cryptic messages. They chose a small diner on the outskirts of town, one that was known for its anonymity. The kind of place where everyone knew each other but no one spoke too loudly. When she arrived, a man in a dark suit stood up to greet her. He was familiar, she had seen him at a few high-profile events, a figure who moved in the circles she had once considered her own. He introduced himself as Thomas Harper. "Michelle," he said, offering her a hand. "I know this isn't easy, but you need to understand something. You're not alone in this. There are more of us fighting for the same cause." Michelle studied him carefully. "Fighting for what?" "Justice," he replied, his voice steady, unwavering. "Real justice. Not the kind that's been hijacked by those who think they can buy their way out of trouble. We've been watching, Michelle. We've seen the things you've uncovered. And we know you're not afraid to fight." Michelle felt a surge of hope, but it was tempered with caution. "So what do you want from me?" "We want you to lead the charge," he said, leaning in closer. "We want you to take down the system that's been corrupting everything from the inside out." The weight of his words hit her like a freight train. This was bigger than just clearing her name or fixing a few broken pieces. This was a battle for the very heart of the justice system itself. Michelle took a deep breath, the realization settling in. She could walk away, but then everything she had ever fought for would have been for nothing. She had to make a stand. "I'm in," she said, the decision final. Thomas smiled, his eyes filled with resolve. "Good. We've got work to do." As Michelle left the diner, the weight of her decision hung on her shoulders, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of purpose. The road ahead would be long, filled with obstacles and danger. But she wasn't going to let fear control her. She was going to fight. The battle for justice had only just begun. And Michelle was ready to take on whatever came next. The days that followed were a blur of strategy meetings, hidden alliances, and whispered conversations in the dark corners of the city. Michelle felt the walls closing in on her from all sides. The truth she had uncovered was far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined, and the more she learned, the more she realized how deep the corruption ran. Thomas Harper's words echoed in her mind, "You're not alone, but you'll have to fight harder than you've ever fought before." They weren't just words of encouragement, they were a grim reality. If she wanted to take down the powerful forces behind the conspiracy, she would need all the help she could get, and she had no illusions about what would happen if she failed. She had learned quickly that the people pulling the strings weren't just faceless bureaucrats in high offices. They were individuals with power, influence, and connections that spanned across industries and governments. They controlled everything: public opinion, the media, the legal system, and even the very laws that were supposed to protect the people. Michelle couldn't believe how naive she had been. She had once believed in the justice system, trusted that the truth would always come to light in the end. But now, that very system seemed like a facade, a tool for those in power to manipulate at will. The truth was a luxury, and in this world, power was everything. But she wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. The meetings with Thomas became more frequent as they strategized their next moves. They were careful, meticulous in their planning. They couldn't afford to make mistakes. Every step they took had to be calculated, every move had to be executed with precision. There was no room for error, not with so much at stake. Their first target was a high-profile lawyer named Victoria Grant, a name that had been cropping up again and again in Michelle's research. Grant was known for her connections to powerful figures in both the corporate and political world. She was also rumored to have ties to a shadowy group that Michelle and Thomas believed was pulling the strings behind the entire conspiracy. It wasn't just Grant's high-powered connections that made her dangerous, it was her reputation. She was untouchable, one of the most influential figures in the legal world. If they wanted to make any progress, they would have to start with her. Michelle sat in the dimly lit room, her laptop open in front of her. She scrolled through pages of legal documents, financial reports, and incriminating emails, each one revealing a little more of the web of deceit that surrounded Grant. Every piece of evidence brought her closer to the truth, and closer to the danger that came with it. "What are you thinking?" Thomas's voice broke through her concentration. Michelle looked up, meeting his gaze. She could see the concern in his eyes, but also the determination. They were in this together, and they couldn't afford to fail. "I'm thinking we need to be smarter about this," she said, closing the laptop. "Grant has too much influence. If we move too quickly, we risk blowing everything. We need to find a way to get close to her, without anyone realizing what we're doing." Thomas nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's risky, but it might be the only way. If we can get her on our side, or at least get her to slip up, then we can take down the whole operation." Michelle took a deep breath, weighing the decision. This wasn't just about getting Grant to confess. This was about toppling a system that had been in place for years, a system that had corrupted everything it touched. If they could take down Grant, they could start dismantling the network that had created her. "We're going to need help," Michelle said, her voice steady despite the anxiety building inside her. "We can't do this alone." "I know," Thomas agreed. "I've already made some calls. We're building a team." Michelle's heart skipped a beat. A team? She hadn't realized just how far Thomas had gone to organize their fight. She had no idea who he had contacted or how many people were involved. All she knew was that, for the first time since this all started, she wasn't alone. Later that evening, Michelle received a message that would shift the balance of the entire operation. It was a single line of text, no subject, no name. "Grant is expecting you. Be careful." Her pulse quickened as she read the words. For months, she had been operating in the shadows, gathering information, building her case. But now, she was being invited into the lion's den. Was this a trap? Michelle's mind raced with possibilities. It could be a setup, a way to lure her into a confrontation where she would be exposed. Or, perhaps it was an opportunity. An opening to get closer to Grant, to see just how far the corruption reached. She needed to act fast. She called Thomas immediately, her voice urgent. "I've got a lead on Grant. She's expecting me." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Are you sure it's a trap?" "I don't know," Michelle admitted, frustration creeping into her voice. "But I can't sit back any longer. I have to take this chance. If we don't, we may never get another shot." "You're right," Thomas said, his tone resolute. "But you need to be careful. Don't trust anyone. Not even those who seem like allies." Michelle hung up the phone, her mind made up. She had no choice but to go. If she was going to bring down the people behind this, she had to face the dangers head-on. The meeting with Grant would be her greatest test yet. She had no idea what to expect, but one thing was certain, the stakes had never been higher. Michelle stood in front of the building where she was supposed to meet Grant, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. She was about to walk into the lion's den, and she had no idea whether she would emerge victorious, or if this would be the end of everything. But she couldn't back down now. She walked forward, steeling herself for whatever was to come. The gathering storm had reached its peak. Now, the real battle was about to begin. The elevator ride up to the top floor of Victoria Grant's private office building felt like the longest moment of Michelle's life. The soft hum of the elevator and the clink of her heels on the polished floor were the only sounds that filled the tense silence. Her heart raced as her mind continued to whirl with thoughts. What was this meeting really about? What was Grant playing at? The doors of the elevator slid open, and Michelle stepped out, trying to appear confident despite the heavy weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. The building around her was sleek and polished, an embodiment of the power and control that Grant wielded over the legal and political worlds. Every corner screamed wealth, influence, and untouchability. This was a world Michelle had never fully understood, but one she had spent the past few months learning about, often through backdoor methods, never as a participant. She was led down a long corridor by a silent security guard, his steps measured, purposeful. When they reached the large, double doors at the end of the hall, he gave her a curt nod and opened the door without a word. Michelle walked in. Inside, the space was as imposing as the building itself. Floor-to-ceiling windows provided a panoramic view of the city skyline, stretching out beneath the setting sun. It was beautiful, yet cold, and Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that everything in this room was designed to remind her just how out of place she was here. Victoria Grant sat behind a large desk made of dark mahogany, her posture upright, her face an unreadable mask. She had the kind of presence that made even the most confident people second-guess themselves, and Michelle felt her pulse quicken as she took in the woman's calculating gaze. "Michelle, I'm glad you could join me." Grant's voice was smooth, but there was an edge to it. "I know this might seem unexpected, but I assure you, there are things we need to discuss." Michelle stood at the doorway for a moment, taking in the atmosphere of the room. She had spent months reading about Grant, researching her every move, and now, here she was, face to face with the woman who had ties to every major figure in the conspiracy she was working to expose. The silence stretched on before Michelle finally spoke, her voice steady despite the whirlwind inside her chest. "I'm not here to talk in circles, Victoria. I know who you are. I know what you've been involved in." Grant's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "Do you now? How quaint." She gestured to the seat across from her, her eyes never leaving Michelle. "Please, sit. Let's have a conversation. I think you'll find it enlightening." Against her better judgment, Michelle sat down. She wasn't here for small talk, but Grant's presence was magnetic, and despite the danger, Michelle couldn't help but wonder how much truth the woman would actually reveal. Maybe, just maybe, this was her chance to expose the whole network. "I'm not interested in your games," Michelle said, leaning forward. "I know what's happening. The network, the manipulation, the way you've turned the system into your personal playground. I'm going to bring you down." For a moment, Grant didn't respond. She simply regarded Michelle with a cold stare, her fingers steepled in front of her. The tension between them was palpable, and Michelle could feel her breath catching in her throat. She couldn't afford to falter now. Not when she was this close. "I don't believe you understand the full picture, Michelle," Grant finally said, her voice low, deliberate. "You think you're fighting for justice, but what you're really doing is working against the system that keeps everything in balance. The people you're after, they're not the real problem. They're simply part of a larger game, one that's been in play for decades." Michelle's mind raced. What was she saying? Grant continued, her eyes glinting with something akin to amusement. "The truth, Michelle, is that you're trying to take down the very structure that has allowed this country to function as it does. You want to tear it all down, but you have no idea what would replace it. People like you always think you know what's best, but you're naive. You have no idea what it takes to maintain the balance." Michelle's heart pounded. She had thought she understood the situation, but Grant's words shook her. "Balance? You call this balance?" Michelle gestured to the opulent office, the towering skyscrapers beyond the windows. "The system you've built isn't balance. It's a house of cards, built on lies and manipulation." Grant's smile didn't fade. "Ah, but it works, doesn't it? You see, Michelle, the truth is not as simple as you would like it to be. There are always sacrifices to be made, always compromises. Without power, without control, chaos reigns. This is not about good versus evil. It's about survival." "Survival?" Michelle repeated, her mind reeling. "Is that what you call it?" Destroying everything for your own gain. Grant's expression softened, just slightly, as if she were trying to reason with Michelle. It's not about gain, dear. It's about stability. And sometimes, to maintain stability, certain sacrifices need to be made. Michelle stood up abruptly. I'm not here to listen to your twisted justifications. I'm here to stop you. Grant's eyes flickered, and for the first time, Michelle saw something other than calm amusement in them, a glimmer of warning. Be careful, Michelle. You're playing a dangerous game, one that you can't win. You're too deep in it now. You won't be able to turn back. Michelle's blood ran cold. Was this a threat? I'm not afraid of you, Victoria, Michelle said, her voice low and firm. Grant's smile faded, replaced by a look that was both calculating and cold. You should be. As Michelle walked out of the office building, she felt as though a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. But it wasn't the relief of having faced down the enemy, it was the burden of understanding just how deep the corruption went. Grant wasn't just a player in this game. She was one of the masterminds, and she wasn't about to back down. Michelle now knew the stakes. The fight had only just begun, but she couldn't do it alone. The question remained, could she trust anyone enough to fight alongside her? Or would she have to go to war alone? Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. Have you ever faced someone who seemed invincible? How did you deal with the threat? Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that she had just crossed a line. One way or another, the battle was now out in the open. The world she thought she knew had become a shadowy, dangerous place, and the stakes had just gotten much higher. And she was ready for whatever came next. The following days felt like a blur. Michelle couldn't escape the haunting weight of her conversation with Victoria Grant. The woman's chilling words echoed in her mind, leaving behind a feeling of dread. You won't be able to turn back. It was clear now, this was no longer just a battle for justice, it was a fight for survival. Her encounter with Grant had left her shaken, but Michelle knew that backing down was not an option. She couldn't let fear paralyze her. She had to keep moving forward, even if the path ahead seemed darker than ever. Thomas had been by her side through it all. He knew Michelle was struggling, even if she tried to mask it. She had become a different person over the past few weeks, hardened, more determined, but also burdened by the realization that she was in way over her head. They had gone through the details of Grant's empire again and again, trying to find some crack, some way to bring it all crumbling down. But each new discovery only revealed how deep the corruption ran, how many people were invested in keeping it all standing. One night, as Michelle sat at her desk, staring at the endless files that had become her life, her phone buzzed. She picked it up, expecting another update from Thomas, but what she saw made her blood run cold. It was an anonymous message, the kind of message that could only mean one thing, danger. We know what you're trying to do. You're already too late. The clock's ticking. Her heart skipped a beat. She quickly scanned the rest of the message, looking for some clue about who had sent it. There was nothing. Just a series of cryptic warnings and a link to a video. Michelle hesitated for only a moment before clicking on the link. The video was grainy, shot in a dark room, with someone wearing a hood standing at the center. The voice that came through was distorted, but Michelle could make out enough of the words to feel her stomach tighten. The web you're tangled in is much bigger than you think. It's not just about Victoria Grant. There are more powerful forces at play here. People who won't stop until they've crushed you. The video cut off abruptly, and Michelle was left staring at a blank screen, her mind racing. Who was behind this? How much did they know? And what did they mean by more powerful forces? Was she really in over her head? She quickly locked her phone and stood up from her desk, pacing back and forth. The tension was overwhelming. Her instincts screamed at her to act, but there was a gnawing fear that made every decision feel like a risk. Just then, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Thomas. I just got word. They know we're on to them. Be careful. We need to move fast. Her hands trembled as she typed back. What do we do? The response came almost instantly. I've got an emergency meeting set up with an old contact of mine. Someone who might have answers. Meet me in 1 hour. Don't go alone. Michelle hesitated for only a second before typing, I'll be there. She grabbed her jacket and left the office, her mind racing. She wasn't sure what was coming next, but she knew that time was running out. Whoever was pulling the strings now had no intention of letting her expose them. The meeting spot was an old diner on the edge of town. It wasn't the kind of place Michelle usually frequented, but she knew Thomas would want to meet somewhere discreet. When she walked through the door, she immediately spotted him in a booth in the back, his face tense with worry. He stood as soon as he saw her, pulling out a chair for her to sit. I'm glad you made it, he said, his voice low. Things just got a lot more complicated. Michelle sat down, not waiting for him to finish. What do you know? Who's behind this? What's going on? Thomas ran a hand through his hair, frustration etched on his face. I've been trying to track down the source of the messages. I think we've underestimated how many people are involved in this. He leaned in closer. Michelle, there's something I need to tell you. Something I didn't want to say before, but I think you need to hear it now. Michelle's heart sank. What is it? Thomas's gaze faltered for a moment, and for the first time, Michelle saw the doubt in his eyes. Grant isn't the end of this. She's just a pawn in a much bigger game. The people behind all of this, they're untouchable. They control everything, Michelle. Every system, every law. This isn't just a political or corporate conspiracy. This is global. And they've been planning this for years. Michelle stared at him, her mind reeling. Global. The scope of it was unimaginable. Who are they? She whispered. Thomas leaned back, his expression grim. I don't know for sure. But I've been following a trail, and I think it leads to something much darker than just corporate greed or political power. These people, they're above everything. They don't care about laws, about governments, about anything. They only care about control. Michelle's mind spun. She had known this fight was dangerous, but she hadn't realized just how dangerous it really was. She had been playing a game against enemies who were already 5 steps ahead. And now, it felt like the game was rigged from the start. Just then, the diner's door swung open with a sharp bang, and Michelle's heart stopped. A man in a dark suit walked in, his eyes scanning the room, before locking onto her and Thomas. Michelle's blood ran cold. It was the same man from the video. Michelle's hand instinctively moved to the gun hidden beneath her jacket, but she was too slow. The man was already heading toward them, his steps deliberate, his expression unreadable. The game had just changed, and the stakes were higher than she could have ever imagined. The man in the dark suit walked toward Michelle and Thomas with unhurried steps, his eyes locked onto them, as if he knew exactly who they were and why they were there. The air in the diner grew thick with tension, every person in the room suddenly aware that something was off. Michelle's grip tightened on the gun beneath her jacket. She had never expected the danger to feel so real, so immediate. Who was this man? Her pulse quickened as he drew closer. Don't do anything rash, Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. Michelle nodded, trying to keep her composure. Don't escalate the situation. Keep calm. Think. The man stopped just a few feet from their booth, his presence commanding attention. He didn't sit down, merely standing there, his expression unreadable. His face was sharp, cold, with piercing eyes that seemed to look right through her. A shiver ran down her spine. I'm surprised you two haven't run yet, the man said, his voice smooth, almost too calm for someone who clearly wasn't here for a friendly chat. Michelle didn't respond right away. She couldn't. Her mind was working too quickly, processing everything. This was it. The moment she had feared. The moment the noose started to tighten. Thomas was the first to speak. "We don't know what you want, but you've got the wrong people." The man smiled, a cold, humorless smile that sent chills down Michelle's back. "Oh, I think you know exactly what I want. You're meddling in something you don't fully understand. And now, well, it's time for you to pay the price." Michelle stood up slowly, her hand still firmly gripping the gun beneath her jacket. She had to stay in control, or she'd lose everything. "Who sent you?" she asked, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "And what do you want from us?" The man's eyes narrowed, and his smile faded into something more sinister. "I didn't come here to talk. I came to deliver a message." Before Michelle could respond, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder, thick, with several pieces of paper spilling out of it. He placed it on the table between them, his fingers lingering just a moment too long on the edges. The sense of threat in his posture was unmistakable. "Open it," he said, his voice low. "And you'll understand why it's too late to turn back. You're in this, whether you like it or not." Thomas shot a quick glance at Michelle, his eyes searching hers for answers. They both knew the risk of opening that folder. Whatever was inside could be the final nail in their coffin. But at this point, what choice did they have? They needed to know what they were up against. Michelle nodded, her fingers trembling slightly as she reached for the folder. She slowly pulled it toward her, flipped it open, and began to read. The papers were filled with high-level legal documents, names she recognized, names she didn't, and references to meetings and transactions that stretched across borders. Everything was linked, everything was connected, an intricate web of influence, manipulation, and control. But there was one detail that caught her eye. The final page was a photograph. It was a grainy shot, taken from a distance, but there was no mistaking the man in the picture. It was Thomas. Michelle's blood ran cold. What the hell was going on? Thomas had been involved in this? No. It couldn't be. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with confusion and shock. Thomas's face was pale, his jaw clenched. "This isn't what it looks like," he said, his voice shaking, but there was no mistaking the fear in his eyes. "Michelle, I swear, I didn't know they were involved. I didn't know who they were." The man in the suit gave a dry laugh. "Oh, please. Do you honestly think you can hide behind that excuse? This isn't some game anymore, Thomas. Your past is coming back to haunt you." Michelle's mind spun, trying to piece together the truth. Was Thomas involved in this conspiracy all along? Had he been playing both sides? She didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was right in front of her. Thomas looked at her with desperation. "I didn't have a choice. You have to believe me. They've been blackmailing me. I was trying to protect you, to protect us both. This isn't what I wanted." But Michelle wasn't sure what to think anymore. Everything was falling apart. The man in the suit seemed to sense her hesitation. "You want to know the real reason I'm here?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "It's because you've already crossed the point of no return. You think you can expose us, but you're nothing but pawns in a game you'll never win." Michelle's world felt like it was crashing down around her. She had trusted Thomas, but now it seemed like everything was built on a lie. She looked down at the photograph again, the anger and betrayal burning in her chest. "Who else knows about this?" Michelle demanded, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. "How many others are involved?" The man smirked. "It's not about who knows. It's about who can make you disappear before you can ruin everything. And that's exactly what will happen if you keep pushing. You've already made your move. Now we'll make ours." Before Michelle could say anything else, the man turned and left the diner as quickly as he had come, leaving behind a chilling silence that seemed to hang in the air. Michelle and Thomas remained in the booth, both lost in their own thoughts. The weight of what had just been revealed was suffocating. For the first time, Michelle didn't know what to do next. The enemy was more dangerous than she had imagined, and even Thomas, someone she had thought she could trust, had been caught in their web. She had to make a decision. Was this fight still worth it? Or had she already lost? Michelle's heart raced as she stared at the empty diner, the reality of the situation sinking in. She had no choice now. The only thing left was to keep moving forward, into the unknown, and hope she could find a way to survive the game that had just gotten much deadlier. The silence in the diner was deafening. Michelle sat frozen in her seat, staring at the door through which the man had just exited. Her mind was in turmoil, her heart a jumbled mess of emotions she couldn't begin to untangle. Betrayal. Fear. Rage. All swirling together into something that threatened to consume her. Thomas sat opposite her, his hands clenched tightly around the edge of the table. He hadn't spoken since the man in the suit left, and Michelle couldn't bring herself to look at him. The photograph, the damning evidence, how had it come to this? How had she let herself be drawn into a world so full of lies and deceit? She thought she had been prepared for anything, but this? This was a whole new level of betrayal. Thomas finally spoke, his voice hoarse, as if the words had been stuck in his throat. Michelle. I never wanted this to happen. I didn't ask for any of this. She glanced at him, but she couldn't find the strength to respond. The anger inside her was too much, too raw. She wanted to yell, to demand answers, but something deep inside her told her that wouldn't help. It wouldn't fix anything. Instead, she stood up, her mind set on one thing. I need to know everything, Thomas. Everything. No more secrets. Thomas ran a hand through his hair, frustration and fear written all over his face. I didn't want to involve you in this. You have to understand, they came after me first. It was supposed to be a one-time thing, just one job. But then they kept pulling me deeper, and I couldn't get out. And when you came into the picture, I thought I could protect you. I thought I could shield you from it. Her eyes narrowed as she slowly backed away from the table, feeling the walls close in on her. And how did that work out for you, Thomas? She asked, her voice trembling with emotion. You didn't protect me. You put me right in the middle of this. Thomas looked down, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of his guilt was finally breaking through. I never wanted this to happen, Michelle. But the deeper I got, the more entangled I became in their web. They have everything on me, my past, my mistakes, my fears. They knew exactly how to pull my strings. Michelle clenched her fists, trying to keep her composure. She couldn't let her emotions control her, not now. And what about me? What about my fight for justice? Was that just a distraction for you while you were busy with your own demons? Thomas reached out, desperation in his eyes. No, Michelle. It was never like that. I swear. I wanted to help you. But I was scared. Scared of what would happen if I told you the truth. I didn't want to lose you. Michelle's breath caught in her throat. He didn't want to lose me. The words stung like a slap in the face, but there was a part of her that understood what he was saying. Maybe even sympathized. But understanding didn't erase the damage that had been done. She took a step back, trying to clear her head. This wasn't just about Thomas anymore. It was bigger than that. They were up against forces that neither of them truly understood. Forces that could destroy them both. I don't know what to believe anymore, Michelle said quietly. I don't know if I can trust you, Thomas. The pain in his eyes was evident, but Michelle didn't know if she could forgive him. She didn't know if she could ever go back to the way things were. Before he could respond, her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking the heavy silence between them. Michelle's fingers were shaking as she pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was an encrypted message from an unknown source, marked only by a series of numbers. "We know you're coming for us. We'll be ready. This is just the beginning." The text sent a chill down her spine, the words like a death sentence. Michelle's thoughts whirled as she tried to make sense of it. Who was this? Was it one of Grant's people? Or someone else entirely? Thomas saw the look on her face and leaned in, his voice urgent. "What is it, Michelle? Who's trying to contact you now?" She didn't answer him right away, her mind spinning. She had to act fast. They were running out of time, and now it was clear that whoever they were up against had no intention of letting them walk away unscathed. "We need to meet with my contact," Michelle said finally, her voice firm. "Someone who can help us get out of this mess." Thomas raised an eyebrow, confusion flashing across his face. "Your contact? Who's that?" Michelle met his gaze. "A hacker. Someone who knows how to get information from the people who think they're untouchable." Without waiting for his response, she turned and walked toward the door. She didn't have time for explanations. They needed answers, and fast. The game had shifted, and now it was a race against time. She couldn't afford to lose any more ground. As they left the diner, Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in around them. They were being hunted, trapped in a web they didn't understand. But there was no turning back now. Not after everything they had learned. They had to keep moving forward, even if it meant putting everything on the line. Michelle's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped into the night air, the weight of the unknown pressing down on her. The world she had known was gone, replaced by a dangerous, shadowy existence filled with enemies at every turn. But she had no choice now. She was in this fight, and there was no turning back. The stakes had just gotten higher. The path ahead was murky, but she would keep walking it, step by step, no matter what. The streets were eerily quiet as Michelle and Thomas hurried down the dimly lit sidewalk. The city's usual hum seemed to have been swallowed by the darkness that hung in the air, and the only sounds were the hurried footfalls of the two of them as they moved in sync toward their destination. Michelle's heart was still racing from the exchange in the diner. The bombshell revelation about Thomas, about his involvement in this conspiracy, had left her reeling. She had thought she knew him, trusted him, but now everything seemed like a lie. He had been keeping secrets from her, and the worst part was that she didn't know what was true anymore. But there was no time to process it. No time to linger on the emotions swirling inside her. They were up against something much bigger than a personal betrayal now. Whatever that message on her phone meant, it was clear that the stakes had been raised. The enemy was watching, and Michelle knew that they wouldn't stop until they had wiped her, and anyone associated with her, out of the picture. "We're almost there," Thomas said, his voice low, eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of danger. "This contact of yours, they can actually help us, right?" Michelle glanced over at him, trying to gauge the sincerity in his eyes. His desperation was palpable, but how could she trust him? Could she still trust anyone? She had been burned so many times already, but the hacker she was meeting was her best shot at getting the answers she needed. The information they needed to make sense of everything. She nodded, her lips pressed together in a tight line. "They can help. But we need to be careful. If they're watching us, if they've already tracked our movements, then we might be walking straight into a trap." Thomas gave her a wary glance but didn't argue. He seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, and that only made Michelle's heart beat faster. The closer they got to the meeting point, the more she felt like they were headed into the jaws of something far worse than what they'd already encountered. They turned the corner and reached an unmarked building, nothing special, just another nondescript structure in the heart of the city. The dim streetlights barely illuminated the entrance, which was a small, unmarked door tucked between two larger, more imposing buildings. Michelle stepped up to the door and knocked twice, the sound echoing in the quiet alleyway. She didn't look back at Thomas, even though she could feel his presence behind her, tense and unsure. The door creaked open just a moment later, revealing a narrow hallway lined with old brick walls. A young woman with short, dark hair and a serious expression greeted them. "You're late," she said flatly, before stepping aside to let them in. "Come on." Michelle stepped inside, Thomas following closely behind. As soon as they crossed the threshold, the door shut behind them with a loud thud. The room was small, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and cigarette smoke. Multiple monitors were flickering on the desk in the corner of the room, and the hacker's fingers moved quickly over the keyboard as she sat in front of them. "I'm sorry we had to meet like this," Michelle said, her voice low. "But we need your help." The woman barely looked up from the screen as she spoke. "If you're here, that means you're in deep. What do you need?" Michelle exhaled slowly and glanced at Thomas before addressing the hacker. "We need to know who's behind this. The people who've been pulling the strings. I'm getting messages, and I'm sure it's all connected. There's a bigger game at play, and we need to find out who's running it before it's too late." The hacker didn't answer right away. Her eyes flickered across the monitors, her fingers pausing for only a brief moment as she analyzed the data flashing across the screen. Then, without warning, she typed something into the computer. A series of numbers and codes blinked in rapid succession. Michelle stood still, holding her breath, waiting for the hacker's response. Finally, the woman let out a long breath. "I've got something," she said, turning around to face them. "But I'm not sure it's going to be what you want to hear." Thomas's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" The hacker glanced at him. "What I mean is that the people you're dealing with, whoever they are, they've covered their tracks so well, it's going to take some time to dig through the mess. But from what I've found, this goes deeper than you think." Michelle's chest tightened. She had feared that they were only scratching the surface. "How deep?" she asked. The hacker tapped the desk with her fingers, her eyes flicking between Michelle and Thomas. "This is a global operation. They're not just after you. They're after anyone who stands in their way, anyone who could expose them. And they've got agents in all the right places." Michelle's blood ran cold. "Are you saying this is bigger than just a few corrupt individuals? We're talking about an entire network?" The hacker nodded slowly. "Exactly. This is an operation that spans across countries, industries, even governments. You're up against the kind of power that doesn't just let people walk away. And once they know you're coming for them, they won't hesitate to eliminate you." Michelle felt a chill creep down her spine. This wasn't just about a few corrupt people anymore. It was about something far more dangerous than she could have imagined. Thomas cursed under his breath. "Then we're already dead." Michelle shook her head. "No. We fight. We fight back." The hacker eyed them both for a moment, clearly sizing them up. "You're going to need more than just guts to take them down. If you want to survive, you'll need to get out of the open. I've found a safe house. It's not much, but it'll give you time to plan." Michelle felt a surge of hope. A safe house. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. "Where is it?" The hacker quickly typed out the address and handed Michelle a small, unmarked flash drive. "Take this. There's more information on here. You'll need it." Michelle took the drive, her grip tight. "Thank you." The hacker gave them a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Just remember, you're not the only ones being hunted. You need to stay ahead of them, or this ends badly for all of you." As they turned to leave, Michelle's thoughts were racing. They were in the thick of it now, there was no turning back. She had come this far, and she wasn't about to let this opportunity slip through her fingers. She had to stop the people behind this operation, no matter the cost. And whatever it took, she would make them pay. Michelle's heart was pounding as they stepped back into the cold night air. The path ahead was fraught with danger, but she knew there was no other choice. They had to keep moving, keep fighting. Time was running out. The rain started to fall as Michelle and Thomas made their way through the back alleys of the city, the streets slick and glistening under the glow of the few streetlights that managed to pierce through the night. Each step echoed in the silence, their feet splashing in puddles as the weight of their situation sank in. The hacker's words repeated in Michelle's mind like a warning. "You're not the only ones being hunted." A cold shiver ran down her spine as she thought about the forces chasing them, a network of power and influence too vast to comprehend. She had always believed in justice, in the law, but now, it seemed like they were up against something far more sinister, something that had no regard for either. Thomas walked beside her, his expression unreadable. He hadn't spoken much since leaving the hacker's hideout, and Michelle couldn't blame him. She herself was struggling to process everything. The safe house was their last shot. The information on the flash drive, the lead that could finally give them the upper hand, was their ticket to understanding just how far this conspiracy went. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized how little they truly knew. Who were these people who could orchestrate such a vast, dangerous operation? And why were they targeting her? What had she gotten involved in? She glanced at Thomas. "Do you trust her?" "The hacker?" Thomas shifted his gaze, his footsteps quickening a little. "I trust her enough to give us a fighting chance. But we're walking into the unknown, Michelle. We don't know who we can trust anymore." Michelle didn't reply. He was right. Trust had become a luxury they couldn't afford. They turned another corner, and there it was, a run-down, abandoned building, just as the hacker had described. It looked completely unremarkable, just another piece of urban decay. But Michelle knew better than to judge a book by its cover. She had to keep her guard up. The door to the building was rusted and covered in grime, a stark contrast to the gleaming tech in the hacker's office. But the address checked out. This was the place. She knocked 3 times, the sound sharp against the rain-soaked silence. After a few moments, the door creaked open, revealing a tall man with sharp eyes and a serious expression. He gave Michelle a once-over before stepping aside to let them in. "Michelle Waters, I assume?" His voice was low, but it held a quiet authority. "That's me," she replied, her voice steady despite the uncertainty swirling inside her. "We're here for the safe house." The man nodded and stepped back. "Come in. Quickly." They entered, and Michelle couldn't help but feel a sense of unease settle over her. The interior of the safe house was stark and functional, bare concrete floors, metal furniture, dim lighting. But it was secure. That much she could tell. And security was exactly what they needed. "This place is safe," the man said, locking the door behind them. "For now." Michelle and Thomas exchanged a look, both knowing that safe was a relative term in their situation. The man led them through a narrow hallway to a room at the back. Inside was a bed, a small desk, and a few scattered supplies. It wasn't much, but it was enough for the time being. "I'll keep watch outside," the man said. "You'll be left in peace here, for a while. But I'll need that drive." Michelle hesitated for a moment before pulling the flash drive from her pocket and handing it over. She had no reason to doubt this man, but in this world, trust didn't come easily anymore. He took the drive without a word, turning toward a small laptop on the desk. His fingers worked quickly, connecting the drive to the computer. A few moments later, the screen lit up with data, an avalanche of information that could change everything. Thomas walked to the window, peering through the blinds, his back to Michelle as he whispered, "What do we do now? How do we stop this?" Michelle couldn't answer him immediately. The weight of their situation pressed down on her chest, but she refused to let herself falter. She had to remain focused. She had to push through, for herself, for Thomas, and for everyone else who might be in danger because of this conspiracy. "I don't know yet," she said quietly. "But we have to keep moving forward. One step at a time." The man at the desk suddenly straightened, his eyes wide as he stared at the screen. This is bigger than I thought. Michelle's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? The man turned to face them, his expression grim. The files on this drive, whoever's behind this, they've infiltrated everything. Corporate power, government agencies, even international organizations. It's not just one conspiracy. It's a network, interconnected, insidious, and deeply entrenched. Michelle's stomach churned. This wasn't just a rogue operation. It was a system. A system that had grown so powerful that it could control everything. And she had walked right into it. Who's at the top of this network? Thomas asked, his voice low, tense. The man shook his head. It's not that simple. The top isn't just one person. It's a group, an elite circle that's been operating in the shadows for years. But there's one name that keeps coming up. A name tied to everything. Elon Musk. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Michelle felt the blood drain from her face as she processed what he was saying. She had known that Musk's name had been involved in the conspiracy somehow, but this? This was something else. Are you saying Musk is behind all of this? She asked, her voice shaking with disbelief. The man didn't answer immediately, instead turning back to the computer. I don't know yet. But I'm getting closer to the truth. We need to dig deeper, find out who he's really working with. Michelle's mind was spinning. Musk. It had always been about him, even if she hadn't wanted to admit it. And now, it seemed like the entire conspiracy might lead straight to him. She felt a flicker of hope ignite inside her. This was the break they needed. If they could get to the bottom of this, they might just have a chance to stop it. But the road ahead would be even darker than before. She could feel it. The higher they climbed, the harder the fall. We need to act fast, Michelle said, her voice low and determined. Before they come for us. Thomas nodded. We're in this together, Michelle. Whatever happens, we're going to see this through. Michelle didn't respond right away. She was still processing everything, but in that moment, she realized one thing for sure, there was no turning back. They were in it now, deeper than they had ever been before. And it was going to take everything they had to bring the truth to light. As Michelle watched the rain fall outside, her mind raced with the possibility of what lay ahead. They had the information, but now they needed to act. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but with every answer came even more questions. The deeper they went, the more dangerous the journey would become. And yet, there was no turning back. Not now. The night seemed to stretch on forever. Michelle sat in the dimly lit safe house, her eyes fixed on the blinking screen of the laptop. The data from the flash drive seemed endless, lines of code, encrypted files, names, and numbers. But none of it made sense yet. It was as if they were standing at the edge of a vast abyss, just beginning to understand how deep the conspiracy went. And with each passing second, it felt like the enemy was circling closer, watching their every move. Thomas was pacing in the corner, occasionally glancing over his shoulder at the laptop. He was nervous, his jaw clenched tight, his fingers twitching as if ready to spring into action at any moment. Michelle couldn't blame him. They were in uncharted territory now, and the stakes had never been higher. She reached for a file on the table and flipped it open. There were references to private meetings, coded messages, and addresses in places she had never heard of. And then there was the name that had haunted her from the start, Elon Musk. There it was again, tied to everything. But the most unsettling thing was the pattern. The deeper they dug, the more connections appeared, and each one led back to Musk. It was as if he was at the center of a spider's web, pulling strings, manipulating events, and controlling everything from behind the scenes. The thought of it made Michelle's skin crawl. Any luck with that? Thomas asked, his voice snapping her back to reality. Michelle didn't look up, keeping her focus on the screen. Not yet. But I found something. It's about a private conference. Musk is scheduled to meet with high-level government officials and corporate leaders next week. It's a closed-door event. Nobody outside the circle knows about it. Thomas stopped pacing and came to stand beside her, leaning over her shoulder to get a better look at the screen. That's our in. If we can get into that conference, we might find something big, something that ties him to everything. Michelle shook her head slowly. Getting in won't be easy. This is the kind of event that's heavily guarded. It's not just a matter of showing up. If we try to infiltrate it, we'll be walking into a trap. Thomas looked frustrated, but Michelle could see the determination in his eyes. What choice do we have? We've been cornered for so long. If we don't act now, they'll come for us. At least this way, we'll be on the offensive. Michelle didn't respond immediately. Part of her agreed. The idea of waiting for the enemy to come to them was terrifying. But on the other hand, everything about this felt like a gamble, one that could cost them more than they were willing to risk. She stared at the screen, thinking about the conference. What was Musk planning? We need to find a way in, Michelle finally said, her voice low and resolute. But we need more than just a plan. We need information. We need to know who's working with him, who else is in this conspiracy. The man who had opened the door for them earlier appeared at the doorway, his face grim as usual. I overheard you two talking, he said, his voice serious. I have something that might help. Michelle looked up at him, startled. What is it? He stepped into the room and placed a file on the table in front of her. This came in from one of my sources. It's a list of individuals with direct ties to Musk's operation. Some of these names are people you wouldn't expect, people with powerful connections in politics, business, even the intelligence community. They're all linked to Musk, but they're hidden behind layers of deception. Michelle's fingers hovered over the file as she carefully opened it. Inside were names, photographs, and encrypted documents. The more she looked, the more she realized how vast the operation was. Musk wasn't working alone. He had allies everywhere. Who are these people? Thomas asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. The man crossed his arms. People who think they're untouchable. People who can hide behind their wealth and power. But there are cracks in the system. If you know where to look, you can expose them. Michelle's eyes lingered on one of the names, an influential senator from a neighboring state. The face in the photo was one she recognized from the news, but she had never suspected his ties to Musk's operation. This was bigger than they had imagined. Much bigger. We can't do this alone, Michelle said, glancing over at Thomas. We need to get in touch with the people who are fighting back against Musk's influence. If we're going to have any chance of stopping this, we'll need help. The man at the door nodded. I've been gathering intel on a resistance group that's been working in the shadows. They're small, but they know how to navigate the system. They might be able to help you get inside the conference. Michelle felt a spark of hope flicker inside her. A resistance. It wasn't just about exposing Musk anymore, it was about rallying others to the cause, people who could stand against him and his empire. Where can we find them? She asked, her voice filled with urgency. They're scattered, the man replied. But I know where you can find one of their contacts. I'll send you the details. Michelle nodded. Thank you. Before she could say anything else, a loud bang echoed from the street outside. The sound of tires screeching to a halt. The man's face went pale, and he quickly moved to the window, peering through the blinds. Michelle and Thomas exchanged a glance, both of them already knowing what was happening. They found us, Michelle said under her breath. We need to move. Now. Thomas grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the back door. Come on. We don't have much time. The man hurried toward the hallway, his voice sharp. The safe house is compromised. Go through the back exit, and don't stop. I'll hold them off for as long as I can. Michelle hesitated for a moment, but there was no time for second thoughts. They had to go. As they rushed out of the safe house and into the dark, rainy streets, Michelle's heart pounded in her chest. They were no longer just fighting against an anonymous enemy. They were fighting against a powerful force that had the resources to find them anywhere, anytime. And now, with the clock ticking down, they had to rely on each other more than ever. As they darted through the streets, Michelle's mind raced. The resistance might be their only chance. But even that might not be enough. There was no going back now. As the rain fell harder, Michelle knew one thing for certain: they were closer than ever to uncovering the truth. But the danger was greater than it had ever been before. The enemy was closing in. And soon, they'd have to face them head-on. The rain was coming down in sheets now, drenching Michelle and Thomas as they darted through the narrow alleyways, their footsteps echoing in the wet darkness. They had barely made it out of the safe house before the first wave of attackers arrived, but Michelle knew they couldn't outrun them forever. It was only a matter of time before they were cornered. The city, usually alive with the hum of traffic and the bustle of late-night crowds, now felt empty, like a stage set for a show that was nearing its climax. There was an eerie silence between the drops of rain, broken only by their hurried footsteps and the occasional distant car. But even the soft patter of the rain seemed to carry the weight of impending danger. "We need to keep moving," Thomas said, his voice tight with urgency. "They'll be looking for us, and they won't stop until they find us." Michelle glanced over her shoulder, instinctively quickening her pace. She could feel the tension building with each step, her heart pounding against her ribcage. But her mind kept coming back to one thing: the resistance. If they could get to them, maybe they could finally turn the tide. They needed allies, and fast. Thomas led the way, navigating through the alleys with an uncanny familiarity that Michelle found both reassuring and unsettling. He had never mentioned being part of any underground resistance before, but in this city, people had secrets, and Thomas had always been a mystery, even to her. "I know where we're going," he said, glancing back at her. His face was shadowed, his eyes focused ahead. "But we can't stay here for long. The place we're going isn't far, but we'll need to move quickly." Michelle nodded, trusting him without question. Right now, her only option was to trust the people around her: Thomas, the mysterious man at the safe house, and the resistance that had been operating in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. After what felt like an eternity, they turned a corner and stopped in front of a narrow door wedged between two abandoned buildings. It was barely noticeable, but Thomas approached it with purpose. He knocked 3 times, the sound sharp in the otherwise quiet night. A low voice called from the other side. "Who is it?" "It's me," Thomas said. "I have Michelle." There was a pause before the door clicked open, revealing a dark figure standing in the doorway. The person was tall, wearing a hood that obscured most of their face, but Michelle could tell from the voice that it was a woman. "Come in, quickly," the woman said, stepping aside to let them through. They entered the dimly lit room, and Michelle's eyes adjusted to the low light. It was small but surprisingly cozy, with a few chairs, a table covered in papers, and a couple of computer monitors humming softly in the corner. On the far wall, a large map of the city was pinned up, dotted with red X's marking various locations. "Who else is here?" Michelle asked, glancing around the room. The woman, who looked to be in her late 30s with sharp features and piercing eyes, motioned for them to sit. "For now, just me. The others are scattered across the city, laying low until we can make our next move. But we've been keeping an eye on you, Michelle. We know what you've been up against." Thomas sat across from the woman, and Michelle followed suit. She could feel her pulse racing in her neck as she absorbed the seriousness of the situation. This was real. The resistance wasn't just a rumor or an underground myth. These people were risking everything to fight back against Musk and the vast network of power he controlled. The woman's eyes flickered between Michelle and Thomas before she spoke again. I'm Kara. I run a small faction of the resistance here in the city. And I know why you're here. Michelle's breath caught in her throat. You've been watching us. Kara nodded, her expression unreadable. We've been watching everyone. People like Musk don't just stay hidden, they control everything, and that makes them vulnerable. We've been looking for cracks in the system, and you, Michelle, have made them visible. You've become a symbol for what's happening to so many people who are too scared to speak out. Michelle shook her head, her mind spinning. I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask to be part of any resistance. All I wanted was to stand for justice. But now, it feels like everything I've ever known has been turned upside down. Kara leaned forward, her eyes softening. You don't get to choose when the fight comes to you, Michelle. It's not a question of asking for it. It's about recognizing that the fight chose you. And right now, you're the one who can make a difference. The weight of Kara's words settled in the room like a heavy fog. Michelle had always prided herself on her sense of right and wrong, on her belief in justice. But now, she was standing in the middle of a war she never saw coming. We've been following Musk's moves for years, Kara continued, her tone firm. But every time we think we're getting closer to the truth, he seems to slip further out of reach. He's connected to people at every level, government, business, military. It's like trying to pull a thread on a tapestry that's been woven too tightly. But you've given us a chance to finally pull it apart. Michelle felt her heart skip a beat. She had never imagined that her actions could have such an impact, but now that she was here, she realized just how much was at stake. The conspiracy was bigger than she had ever dreamed. And if they didn't act, it would continue to grow until it consumed everything. Do you have any idea what's really going on? Thomas asked, his voice low and serious. Kara hesitated before answering, her gaze flicking toward the map on the wall. We know parts of the story. But the full picture, it's still unclear. What we do know is that Musk has built a network so vast, it's embedded in every aspect of society. He's not just trying to control technology or business, he's trying to reshape the world according to his vision. And anyone who gets in his way becomes a target. Michelle sat up straighter, her eyes narrowing. So it's not just about power. It's about control. He's trying to control everything. Kara nodded. Exactly. And if we don't stop him now, it will be too late. But we need to be smart. We need to strike when he least expects it. The upcoming conference, this is our chance. If we can infiltrate it, we can get the evidence we need to expose him for good. Michelle and Thomas exchanged a look. It was the opportunity they had been waiting for, but it came with its own risks. They had to move quickly. There was no time to waste. Are you with us? Kara asked, her eyes locking onto Michelle's. This is the point of no return. Once we make our move, there's no going back. Michelle took a deep breath. Her hands were trembling, but her resolve was stronger than ever. Yes, she said firmly. I'm with you. Kara nodded, a hint of approval in her eyes. Then we'll begin the planning. We'll take Musk down. Together. Michelle's pulse was racing. The next steps would be crucial. The final countdown had begun. Would they succeed in infiltrating the conference? Would they expose the conspiracy for the world to see? The answers were just out of reach, if they could survive long enough to find them. The room was filled with a tense energy as Michelle, Thomas, and Kara huddled around a table cluttered with maps, notes, and a whiteboard covered in scribbles. The walls, adorned with printed photographs of key individuals, government buildings, and major corporations, made it clear that the resistance had been planning this for months, if not years. The conspiracy they were up against wasn't just a few bad actors, it was an intricate web of power, control, and deceit that reached into every corner of society. Michelle's hands were shaking slightly as she studied the blueprints of the conference venue, a high-tech facility located in the heart of the city. It was the kind of place that screamed exclusivity, with high walls, private security checkpoints, and a guest list that included the richest and most powerful people in the world. Getting in wasn't just going to be difficult, it was going to be nearly impossible. "The conference is in 2 days, Kara said, her voice steady but grim. "We have less time than I'd like, but we can't back out now. If we don't expose Musk's operations during this event, we'll never get another chance." Michelle nodded, her thoughts racing. They can't back out now. There's too much at stake. The sheer magnitude of the mission was overwhelming, but she couldn't afford to second-guess herself now. They were on the brink of something huge, and there was no turning back. Thomas leaned in, pointing at a spot on the blueprint. "This is the main entrance. It's guarded, of course, but they'll be focusing on the VIPs. The rest of the security is concentrated around the perimeter. We'll need to get through the back to avoid raising any alarms." Kara nodded. "Exactly. We've been monitoring the security feeds for the last few days, and we've identified a weak spot. There's a service entrance near the loading dock. If we can get there undetected, we can slip inside before the event kicks off." Michelle studied the blueprint carefully, her brow furrowed. "And once we're inside?" Kara glanced at her, her expression resolute. "Once we're in, we split up. You two will head for the main conference room, where Musk is expected to speak. We need to get as close to him as possible. Thomas, you'll plant this." She pulled a small device from her jacket pocket and placed it on the table. It was an encrypted USB drive, the kind used for high-level espionage. "Once it's in the system, it'll give us access to everything. We'll have the leverage we need." Michelle reached for the device, her fingers brushing it. The weight of it in her hand felt heavy, like the fate of everything was tied to this small, unassuming piece of technology. She felt a sense of dread settle in her stomach. It was one thing to fight against a faceless enemy, it was another to know that the very thing you were about to do could change the course of history. "And what about you?" Michelle asked Kara, her voice steady despite the swirl of fear in her chest. "What will you be doing?" Kara gave her a small, confident smile. "I'll be handling communications, making sure that we stay connected and can get out if things go south. I've got a safe house set up nearby, but the moment you've got what you need to leave. This is too big for us to be caught in the middle of. We don't know how much of Musk's operation is already in play." Michelle nodded, understanding the risks. They couldn't afford to get caught, not when the stakes were this high. "So we go in, get the evidence, and get out before anyone notices," Thomas said, looking between Michelle and Kara. "But if something goes wrong, what's the plan?" Kara's face hardened. "We're all in this together. If something goes wrong, you stick to the plan. The exit route is already set up. I'll make sure you have everything you need." Michelle's gaze flicked from Kara to Thomas. This is it. The moment of truth. She felt the pressure of the world bearing down on her shoulders, but she refused to let it overwhelm her. She had a job to do, and she was going to do it. "All right," Michelle said, taking a deep breath. "We're doing this. No second chances. We expose Musk, and we take him down." Thomas looked at her with a rare, genuine smile. "You got it." The next few hours were a whirlwind of preparation. They finalized their plans, making sure that every detail was covered. Thomas and Michelle practiced their cover stories, making sure they could blend in with the high-profile attendees. They had to appear as if they belonged, just another part of the opulent world Musk had built. Any slip-up could mean disaster. Kara handed Michelle a pair of sleek black glasses. "These will help you blend in. They're equipped with a hidden camera and microphone. If you need anything, we'll be able to hear and see it." Michelle adjusted the glasses, feeling the weight of them on her face. The technology was cutting edge, and it made her feel like she was part of a high-stakes spy movie. But the stakes were real. This wasn't a game. They weren't playing at being heroes, they were risking everything for the truth. "Let's go over the plan one more time," Kara said, her voice cutting through the tension. Michelle nodded, trying to calm the fluttering in her chest. This wasn't just about getting into a conference, this was about exposing one of the most dangerous men in the world. Musk wasn't just a businessman, he was a threat to everything Michelle stood for. Thomas leaned over the table, tapping the blueprint once more. "We enter through the back, slip past security, and head straight for the main conference room. We get the data, plant the device, and leave. Simple enough, right?" Kara's lips tightened. If only it were that easy. "Stay alert, trust each other, and don't hesitate." Michelle looked at both of them. They were counting on her. She couldn't let them down. With a final deep breath, she nodded. "Let's do this." The clock was ticking. The mission was set. But with each passing second, Michelle felt the weight of the coming storm. The question wasn't whether they would succeed, it was whether they would make it out alive. The night had fallen silent, the kind of silence that only happens in the calm before a storm. The city's usual buzz of life had quieted down, leaving Michelle and Thomas to prepare for the most dangerous mission of their lives. They stood outside the conference venue, hidden in the shadow of a tall building, the rain still coming down in torrents, masking the sound of their movement. Michelle's heart was pounding, her breath coming in shallow, anxious bursts. The weight of the mission pressed heavily on her shoulders. This wasn't just about exposing Musk, it was about stopping him from cementing his control over everything. And with each step closer to the entrance, the weight felt heavier, more suffocating. "We're almost there," Thomas said in a low voice, his eyes scanning the area. His tone was steady, but Michelle could tell he was just as tense as she was. His hand rested on his side, where the encrypted USB was tucked into his jacket. It was their ticket to the truth, and the one thing that could bring everything crashing down. They crossed the street, moving quickly and quietly, ducking into an alley that led to the back of the venue. The high walls of the building loomed over them, offering a sense of protection but also a reminder of the danger they were about to face. They had to get inside, get the data, and leave without a trace. Simple, right? Except nothing about this mission was simple. As they reached the service entrance, Thomas motioned for Michelle to stop. He pointed to a small, hidden camera above the door. It was one of many that lined the perimeter of the venue. "We'll have to disable that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Michelle glanced around nervously. "How?" Thomas reached into his jacket and pulled out a small device, pressing it against the wall next to the camera. A low beep echoed in the dark, and the camera flickered off. "Done," he said, a brief smile flickering across his face. Michelle let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. "Nice work." Thomas gave her a small nod before turning back to the door. With a steady hand, he reached for the handle, testing it. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow hallway dimly lit by low overhead lights. The scent of old paper and cleaning supplies mixed with the faint smell of something more metallic, perhaps the hum of the building's ventilation system. Michelle's pulse quickened as they slipped inside, closing the door behind them. Every step they took felt like it echoed throughout the dark hallway. The air was thick with tension, and every flicker of light felt like a warning that they weren't alone. They couldn't afford to be spotted. Not now. Not when they were so close. "Left, then right," Thomas whispered, guiding Michelle through the maze of hallways. They passed storage rooms, empty offices, and utility closets, all of them seemingly abandoned. But Michelle knew better. Security was always nearby, and one wrong move could mean the end of their mission. At the end of the corridor, a locked door marked with a small sign read, "Authorized personnel only." Thomas stopped, pulling a small set of tools from his bag. He worked quickly, his hands moving with practiced ease. Michelle kept a lookout, her eyes darting between the hallway and the door as she listened for any approaching footsteps. The click of the lock turning sounded louder than she expected, and she tensed, holding her breath. Thomas pushed the door open, revealing the security hub, row after row of computer monitors, each displaying live footage from various cameras inside and outside the venue. "Go," Thomas muttered, stepping aside to let Michelle through. They slipped into the room, and Michelle felt a sense of unease settle in her chest. This was the heart of the venue's security system. If they didn't disable the cameras here, they wouldn't be able to make it to the conference room unnoticed. Thomas wasted no time. He pulled out the encrypted USB drive and plugged it into one of the computers, typing quickly. The screen flickered for a moment before displaying a series of codes. Thomas scrolled through them, his face tense with concentration. "How much longer?" Michelle asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just a minute," he muttered. "We're in. Now we just need to make sure the cameras stay down long enough for us to get to the main room." Michelle looked over his shoulder, watching the lines of code scroll across the screen. A part of her couldn't believe how close they were. It felt like they had come so far, only to find themselves on the brink of disaster. The moment they stepped out of this room, there would be no turning back. Finally, Thomas hit the enter key, and the screen blinked to confirm their access. "Done," he said, his voice low but filled with relief. "The cameras are down for the next 30 minutes. That should be enough time for us to get to Musk." Michelle exhaled, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. They had done it. They were inside, and now all they had to do was get the evidence. "Let's move," Michelle said, her voice steady now. "We don't have much time." They made their way through the back halls, following the route they had planned. As they neared the main conference room, the tension in Michelle's chest grew. They had to get in without drawing attention. Musk was expected to speak soon, and security would be on high alert once the event started. The hallway grew brighter as they approached the main venue. Michelle could hear the distant murmur of voices and the faint hum of music playing in the background. The crowd was gathering, and they had to slip in unnoticed. They reached the door to the main conference room, where 2 guards were stationed. Their eyes scanned the guests entering and exiting, their faces unreadable. Michelle felt her heartbeat in her throat. This was it. This was where it all came together, or fell apart. Thomas pulled her into the shadows just as the guards turned their attention elsewhere. Michelle's mind raced. They couldn't get caught now. Not after everything they had risked. "Ready?" Thomas whispered. Michelle nodded. "Let's do it." They moved quickly, sliding through the door just as another group of attendees entered. The guards barely glanced their way, their focus still on the VIPs. They were inside. Michelle's heart was pounding as she and Thomas stepped deeper into the lion's den. The mission had reached its breaking point, and everything hinged on the next few moments. Would they succeed? Or would they pay the ultimate price for their bravery? The answers were just ahead, waiting for them to take the final leap. The air inside the grand conference room was thick with anticipation. The rich, polished walls of the venue gleamed under the soft lighting, and the soft murmur of well-dressed guests filled the space as they mingled and prepared for the start of the event. Michelle and Thomas blended in effortlessly, their disguises fooling even the most discerning eye. Despite their outward composure, inside, their nerves were a chaotic storm. Michelle could feel her pulse in her ears, every step she took seeming louder than the last. The closer they got to the front stage, the more tense the atmosphere became. She was acutely aware of the people surrounding them, business leaders, politicians, and tech moguls. But none of that mattered now. They weren't here for the speeches, the promises of technological wonders. They were here to expose Elon Musk. They weaved through the crowd, avoiding the watchful eyes of security and the hawk-eyed assistants who seemed to be everywhere. Every move had to be calculated, every glance had to be careful. They couldn't afford a slip-up. Their destination was clear. The stage was set up directly ahead, where Musk would deliver his keynote. The security was tighter the closer they got. 2 guards stood just outside a velvet rope separating the attendees from the VIP section. Michelle's stomach tightened. They were so close. Just a little further, Thomas whispered beside her. Michelle nodded, her mind racing. This is it. The moment of truth. They reached the VIP section, where a handful of influential figures were already gathered, sipping champagne and talking in low voices. As they approached, a guard gave them a cursory glance before allowing them to pass. Michelle forced herself to remain calm, her steps deliberate as they crossed the threshold into the restricted area. And then, there he was, Elon Musk, standing at the far end of the room, talking animatedly with a group of executives. His tall frame and confident posture made him an unmistakable presence. Michelle's throat went dry. She had seen him on television, read about his companies, heard his promises about saving humanity, but this? This was different. This was real. Her gaze flicked to Thomas, who was already slipping into position behind a row of plush chairs. He was ready to do his part. Now it was Michelle's turn. She took a deep breath and made her way toward a nearby table. She scanned the area for any sign of Musk's security detail, but they were out of sight, yet the feeling of being watched never left. They had to be cautious. She glanced at the USB device in her pocket. This was it. They had to get the data. If Musk's operations were what they suspected, exposing them would be the only way to stop him. Just then, Musk's voice broke through the noise of the room. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time tonight. I promise you, we're on the edge of something incredible. This is just the beginning of a new era for mankind. Michelle's heart skipped a beat. This is it. He's going on stage. We can't wait any longer. Without a second thought, she reached into her pocket, pulling out the device that would unlock everything. As she moved toward the side of the room, she took one last look at Thomas, who nodded back at her. They were in this together. There was no turning back. She moved closer to the stage, blending into the crowd, her eyes locked on Musk. He was the key to everything, and if they could get the evidence they needed, they could end this madness. As the lights dimmed and the crowd hushed, Musk made his way to the stage. The spotlight followed him, casting his shadow long across the floor. A cheer erupted from the audience, the kind of applause reserved for legends. Michelle felt a sharp pang of anger rise in her chest. This man, this charlatan, is manipulating the world. He's not a genius. He's a threat. Taking one last deep breath, she slipped past a pair of security guards, narrowly avoiding their gaze. She was almost there. The USB device in her hand felt heavier with every step. She approached the back of the stage, where the sound and lighting technicians were stationed. There, lying in plain sight, was an unguarded port, exactly where she needed to plant the device. She wasn't the only one trying to infiltrate the event. The resistance had prepared for every possible scenario, and this was the one moment they had been working toward for months. Michelle quickly and expertly slid the USB device into the port, her heart hammering in her chest. The lights flickered for a moment, as though reacting to the presence of the device. She froze, but no one seemed to notice. It's done. Before she could move, the unmistakable voice of Elon Musk echoed through the room. Tonight, I want to talk about a revolution that will change the world, a revolution that only the brave will join. Michelle could hear his words, but they didn't matter anymore. The device was in, the data was transmitting, and the moment she had been waiting for was finally here. Just then, she felt a presence behind her. She turned quickly, only to come face to face with a tall, imposing figure, one of Musk's personal bodyguards. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Michelle's stomach dropped. She had been so focused on the task that she hadn't realized how close she was to being caught. Her pulse quickened as she glanced over her shoulder to see if anyone had noticed. "I'm just, in the wrong place," Michelle stammered, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm supposed to be in the VIP section." The bodyguard didn't look convinced, but before he could say anything more, a voice rang out from the stage. "Elon." It was Thomas, standing at the edge of the VIP section, waving his hand. The bodyguard turned to see who was calling Musk's name, just as Michelle slid out of the way, quietly making her escape. The seconds felt like hours as she merged back into the crowd. Her hands were trembling, and her breath came in short gasps. She had done it. The evidence was in place. They had what they needed. But the real danger was just beginning. As the room erupted into applause, Musk took the stage, his arrogant grin as wide as ever. But Michelle knew the truth. The people here, the ones who cheered for him, had no idea what was happening in the shadows. But they would. They would all know. And nothing would ever be the same. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. What do you think will happen now? Do you think Michelle and Thomas have done enough to take down Musk? What will the fallout be once the truth is exposed? As the crowd cheered, Michelle and Thomas exchanged a brief, silent glance. The storm they had set in motion was only just beginning, and they had no idea how far it would reach. But one thing was certain, there was no going back. The truth was out, and Musk's empire was on the brink of collapse.